Thank you for tuning in to another edition of Outside the Shop with me, your host, Daryl D. Lane, where I get to talk about everything that I normally don't get to talk about in my regular sports podcast, Barbershop Sports Talk, which you guys can all find on Spotify, iTunes, Stitcher, Apple Podcasts, Google Podcasts, iHeartRadio, SoundCloud, or whichever podcasting app or platform you can listen to me via. The last podcast, I had Cody Felker on, host of the Bring the Juice Colts podcast. We talked about a lot of things. We talked about some Indianapolis Colts stuff specifically, but also we got into stuff like Nick Sirianni being that coach of the Philadelphia Eagles, how he thinks that works. What does an offensive coordinator really do for an NFL team? We also talked about AFC South teams, how he feels about Derrick Henry, what Tom Brady has to do in his mind as a Colts fan to surpass Peyton Manning as a GOAT. So really interesting conversation, really interesting interview. I suggest you all check that out again on all your podcasting platforms, Spotify, iTunes, Apple Podcasts, however you listen to your podcasts. For the next podcast that I'm going to be doing, I'm going to be recording this tonight. I'm going to have my guy Scotty Johnson on, and we're going to do NBA tiers. So what that means is we're going to do because everybody always talks about who can be the best person on a championship team. So what I decided me and Scotty are going to do, we're going to talk about who can be the first best player on the championship team out of every player in the NBA. Who is good enough to be the best player on a championship team? Who's good enough to be the second best player on a championship team? And who's good enough to be the third best player on a championship team? And I think we're also going to get into as well who can be the best player of a championship team of all time. So I think like obviously Michael Jordan, Kobe, Larry Bird, Magic, the second best guys. Pau Gasol was second best player on a championship team. Who can be the third best player on a championship team? Guys like Manu Ginobili, Tony Parker. So we're going to get really deep into that. And we'll also talk about some guys I think that who could enter a conversation. Could you ever see, for example, Lonzo Ball being the third best player on the championship team? Right now, I don't think he can, but could you ever see him being that type of guy? So stuff like that, it's going to be really interesting. And thank you, everybody, for tuning in, whether it's via Twitter/Periscope, Facebook Live, and YouTube live stream. Share this however you're listening to. That will be greatly appreciated. So here's what we have today. Baylor wins the NCAA championship. You have Paul Pierce fired from ESPN. Deshaun Watson, more news comes out about his sexual assault allegations. Mac Jones to San Francisco, done deal. Adam Schefter, the god of the NFL, reports that. And QB moves and rumors. So first, let's start here. Baylor, they win 86-70. First of all, I want to say this. I won a decent amount of money. On this. I did a bet with my good friend Silas Garrison, and we bet $50 if I would finish number one in my bracket. And the bracket I had two brackets. I had a John Carroll Friends bracket, and I had a Barbershop Sports Talk bracket. Guys, comment if you want to be in the Barbershop Sports bracket next year, or maybe, who knows, maybe we'll have a Barbershop Fantasy Football bracket. But I ended up getting second. And by the way, shout out to Kenny Sims, scouting expert for 247 Sports, a regular on the podcast. He ended up winning the bracket. He picked the Baylor. And another good friend of mine, Ben Karen, host of the Sports Squad of the podcast. He comes to my podcast a lot too. He ended up finishing third because he picked Baylor. I was in the lead the whole time in this group and ended up because Gonzaga lost. But I ended up winning some money, so I'm happy. I got my $50 from Silas, so I'm happy. Baylor won 86-70 against Gonzaga. Some people were talking about Gonzaga could be the best team ever. I think when we look at this, Gonzaga wasn't overrated. I just think Baylor was a better team. And also what they did is they blew out two teams in the Final Four. They blew out Houston and they blew out Gonzaga. Now, you might say they weren't Power 5 programs. I know my good friend Ben Karen would say they weren't Power 5 programs, but Baylor got the job done. And I think this was a very interesting year. But that Gonzaga team was really good. I didn't think that Gonzaga team would lose, but they did lose. And that's what we love about March Madness. Paul Pierce. So, for those of you who don't know, Paul Pierce, who's usually on the NBA Countdown show with Maria Taylor, Jalen Rose, I think Adrian Wojnarowski's on there sometimes. He got fired, and he got fired because he was on the Instagram Live. He had a bunch of strippers, and he had naked women, right? He looked like he was either drinking or on drugs, and he's also married, by the way, which is none of my business, but I'm just going to put that out there. And he's kind of talking crazy. And obviously, ESPN is affiliated with Disney. Disney, for those of you who don't know, is a children's television program. You cannot do stuff like that for TV. You can do that when you're in the NBA, when you're in the NFL, when you're in the MLB. Hell, even you can do it when you're in political office, but you can't do that when you're affiliated with children. And that was not good for Paul Pierce. So he was let go almost immediately. This happened over the weekend. There were trickling outs that he was going to get fired. Then boom, it came today. I think it's been confirmed. Paul Pierce will be getting let go by ESPN. Love the truth. He always had some crazy takes. He said he was better than Dwayne Wade. He keeps saying LeBron James is not top 5, which I think is crazy. But Paul Pierce is on the outs at ESPN. Next up, what we have here is, so Ashley, and I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing these names wrong, Ashley Solis and Lauren Bexley in the Deshaun Watson case. For those of you who don't know, initially what was happening was in the whole Deshaun Watson ordeal, there was anonymous plaintiffs coming forward. So people that weren't putting their names on this. Even the one woman who decided not to sue Deshaun, and she gave her little testimony to Sports Illustrated, right? That woman did not come forward either. This is the first time we have two women coming forward and putting their names on it. And when you put their names on it, you can look these women up and you can find them. It's a Ashley Solis and a Lauren Bexley. And they came forward and they talked about Deshaun Watson. They mentioned stuff how he's a serial predator. This is not looking good for Deshaun Watson. You never, especially this day and age, like especially as a man, like you don't want people to say, "Hey, he's a serial predator." That does not read right. It's creepy. It just doesn't read right. When people say you're a serial predator, that's not good. When people are willing to put their names on this, you have about 20 plus different women. Now women are starting to put their names on this. It keeps looking worse and worse and worse for Deshaun. And I have to wonder, at what point does this not become legal? Because right now it's more of a money thing. But at what point does this not become legal to where Deshaun Watson can go in jail? Because somebody correct me if I'm wrong. Maybe I'm ignorant to this. Like, this is kind of like a lot of the stuff they're accusing. This is, I believe, you could make the case of sexual assault. Like, you could go to jail. Like, you can go to jail for this stuff. People go to jail for less every day. People go to jail for less every day. So the fact that he couldn't go to jail for this, when it looks like he's obviously done some things that were creepy and that weren't right, bad news bears for Deshaun Watson. Doesn't speak all that well to his character. Okay, so on the football news, the true football news, Adam Schefter reports, and by the way, Adam Schefter's gospel, whatever he says, I listen. He's like the Adrian Wojnarowski of football. He says the 49ers will draft Mac Jones. Before, people were talking about the Trey Lance, the Justin Fields, whether Kyle Shanahan and these guys, they want an athletic mobile quarterback to go forward in this kind of zone running scheme that they use over in San Francisco. And it looks like they're going to go with Mac Jones. And I think it's interesting. I think Mac Jones, looks kind of similarly to Jimmy Garoppolo. They're both kind of game managers. I think Mac Jones has a lot of potential. I think he's better than people think. I think he has a good pocket speed. I think he can extend the field. He can throw the ball down the field. He can thread the needle. He has more arm talent and more physical ability than I think people actually realize when they're watching him. But he's not the sexy choice. He's not the sexy choice. And you wonder, can he be better right away than a Jimmy Garoppolo? Does this make sense? How much good can he get? Right now, Jimmy Garoppolo, in my opinion, is 15 to 20 in the NFL. Okay, if you think Mac Jones is going to be an average QB in the NFL, 15 to 20 is where he's going to be. So it's kind of like, where are we going here? But in terms of Justin Fields, in terms of what it looks like it's going to be Mac Jones. I think Trey Lance, too much of a project. I'm more evaluating film on all these quarterbacks and getting more of a in-depth feel for who they are. Trey Lance, not a big fan. They ran the ball a lot of play action. He had the best team every time he played. I just don't know how sustainable it is. Also, Justin Fields. I love Justin Fields. I think Justin Fields has a lot of talent. I think it's probably closer between Mac Jones and Justin Fields than people think. Mac Jones is really, really good. And Justin Fields, there are some concerns, I think. But I like Justin Fields. But I think it's really interesting that Justin Fields, a guy who was always neck and neck with Trevor Lawrence, who could be the best quarterback in a couple of years, and it's going to be Trevor Lawrence still at number one. And not only is Justin Fields going to get passed over for a dude, Zach Wilson, who nobody heard about before this football year, he could get passed over for Mac Jones and be the fourth quarterback off the board. That's not good. That is not good at all. Sam Darnold, formerly of the New York Jets, was just traded to the Carolina Panthers for a 2021 sixth-round pick, 2022 second-round pick, and a 2022 fourth-round pick. That's a lot of returns for Sam Darnold. A lot of people think Sam Darnold's hard garbage, trash, and you don't want him, right? The fact that the Jets could recoup that, looks like they're going to get Zach Wilson. I'm a big fan of Zach Wilson. That's impressive. I think Sam Darnold gets hated on a little bit too much. He's better than you guys think. He's gotten a lot of opportunities, but obviously we know Adam Gase is an abomination as a head coach. The Jets haven't had much talent. He's been hit a lot. One time I know it was famous. He was talking on Monday Night Football how he's seeing ghosts, but that's really how it was in New York. He didn't have a lot of help. It was just a bad situation that nobody could succeed in. So I think it's going to be really interesting to see what he can do with Carolina. When you get him with Matt Rule, when you get him with DJ Moore, all these different guys that can make plays, a better defense, and a better solid organization where he can make some plays. And maybe he's a young quarterback. And let's remember, Sam Darnold was drafted third overall for a reason. I believe coming into that year, it was him or Josh Rosen for who would be the number one pick in the draft. People weren't talking about Baker Mayfield. People weren't talking about Lamar Jackson. People weren't talking about Josh Allen. And it's ironic, those were the three guys who ended up being the best quarterbacks in the draft, but that's another story for a whole nother day. And lastly, with Sam Darnold going to the Panthers, it looks like Teddy Bridgewater will be traded. Some teams that I've heard people float out are teams like the Denver Broncos and teams like that. Teddy, he was never really the same after that torn ACL. After that injury he had with the Minnesota Vikings in the playoffs. Really never the same after that. But solid game manager. I know he played well sparingly when Drew Brees came out, but obviously everybody plays well when Drew Brees comes out for the Saints because you have Sean Payton and all those different offensive weapons and toys. But Teddy Bridgewater, I think he could be a good, solid backup maybe. But I think at the end of the day, he has a limit. He has a cap for himself as a starting quarterback. That's just what it is for Teddy Bridgewater. And that's all we have for this edition of Outside the Shop with me, your host, Daryl D. Lane. Below is a link to an article I wrote. It was the top interior defensive lineman in this upcoming NFL draft. If your team needs an interior defensive lineman, check out the article. The link is below in the descriptions. Also, subscribe to the YouTube channel. Just type in Daryl Lane and you'll find it. Also, share this show. However you're listening, share it. And stay tuned for the podcast that I'll be releasing tomorrow. I'll be recording it tonight about the NBA and hierarchies. Have a great day.